but we don't, so, but it's a GET request, so our request body is empty. We're not getting anything in the request. Okay, now let's see what the response from the server will look like. So RES stands for response. And this is going to have the status code. So 200 means, okay, we're solid, we found the stories. And then it'll also have the information that we requested. So in this case, we're going to have an array, or a list, of JavaScript objects that each represent a story. So we might have creator, and something, content, something. And then we might have, let's say we have 2 stories on our page. So we have 2 of those. Something like that. Okay, so that's the basic workflow. Where's my yellow top? Here's my yellow top. So step 1 is the client sends a GET request. So it sends an HTTP request to the server. And then we send the request across the network, and then the server receives it. So step 2 is server, sorry, this is not big enough to read. Server receives request. And then next up, the server gets the data that it needs, and then the server sends a response. And then the response travels across the network, and step 4 is once the client receives the response, it'll render it on it'll render what it got back on the browser. Okay, while I'm writing that, I can give you a question, so feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions. Okay. How are we doing on understanding for this workflow of what's going on here? Okay, not bad. Alright, so now let's see what that looks like in code. Because this makes sense on a high level, but when you actually start writing code is when it may or may not get a little wonky. So in our front end, in our React code, you might have seen something inside like a use effect or something that looks like this. Get, and then the API endpoint, so it's /stories in this case. And then in here, there, and then a .then. And then in the .then there was a callback function that took in story objects. And then rendered those stories to the front end. Or rendered those stories to the browser. And then on our back end, in our server code, in API.js, you might have seen something that said router.get, and then /stories, and then a callback function that takes in rec and res. And then what it would do is it would get the stories from the data, and then it would do a res.send. So it would send back the stories that it got. So let's see how this code corresponds to those 4 steps. And something that a lot of people were a little confused on is what's the difference between these 2. So we're going to dive into that. So first off, the client has to send an HTTP request. And that's this. So this is actually a function that Web Lab staff wrote for you guys. But basically, what this does is it sends an HTTP request that looks like that up there. And then step 2, okay, so this is step 1. And then what we're doing when we say this is we're saying, okay, hey router, when you receive an HTTP GET request to the /stories endpoint, I want you to do this. And so this is basically setting up listening to the request. Alright, this is step 2. And then step 3, the server sending the response back. Well, when the server receives the request, what we wanted to do is get the stories from data and send it back. So this is step 3, sending the response. And then the response looks something like that. When we say rest.send stories, it just fills in this body of the response with the stories. So that goes back across the network. And then when the client receives the response, that's this code here, the .then, which is a slightly wonky word. Is it saying this get /stories is a promise, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. But basically, when this promise resolves, so when the .then is called, that's when we receive the response from the server. So then the response that the server receives, that array of stories, is going to be story objects, and then we're going to render it on the front end. So that's step 4. We send the GET request, the server receives the GET request, the server gets the data you want, the server sends the data you want, and then the client renders it so that you can see it on your browser. Any questions on this? Okay, cool. Now I'm going to hand off to Tony, who's going to show you guys what this looks like in actual code, so you can see it in context.
Is your okay? All right, so.
Can you make this a lot bigger?
Wait, Tony, can you join the Zoom?
I will join the Zoom.
While Tony, let me know when you're done joining the Zoom, but while we're doing that, I will explain some more things. Sometimes we want to pass in information with our GET request, because /stories, all you need to do is get all the stories. But if we want to get comments, then we would need to pass in information about what comments we want to get. From front end, we need to give the back end information about what comments we want to get. And so that's where the query parameter comes in. So if we were to do a GET request to get comments, then not only would this change to be /comment, we would also want to add a query parameter that tells us, okay, which story do you want to get the comments that are under? Are you good? Okay, cool. I will pass it off to Hayden to make that comments.
So, in the code, this is around workshop 5 complete. If you, it's not the right code. So, 2 things going on here is that I'm going to have localhost 3000 running, and I'm going to have localhost 5050 running. Localhost 5050 is going to be the client side. It's going to be everything that we're going to interact. The user is going to interact. So it's going to be the front end that the user will see. The back end, which is at localhost 3000, is going to have all the API endpoints sitting and waiting for the client to ask it for something. So on the API side, there's going to be something like the stories endpoint, which has a predefined function that says, when I receive something, in this case, an empty list, an empty object, I'm going to give you back all the stories. So we're going to walk through where all of that is in code. So the get stories endpoint is here. The get stories endpoint is here in free.js. And the use effect is saying, since there's an empty array, it's saying that whenever we first load the web page, what will happen? Well, we are going to send a GET request right here to the stories API. The .then function, what it's saying is once it is fulfilled, once I receive something, here is the callback function that I'm going to call. But in sequence, we call the GET API stories, and then here in the server folder, what we have is here. So here is where it actually lands. And there is a rec and a res. These are predefined in Express, and they're tools to help us basically manage these API endpoints. rec is going to be some of the information about the request you receive, and res is going to be the tool that we use to send back. So here, since the stories endpoint is not sending anything, so it's single in feed.js, we don't actually send any data. There's usually a parameter here for you to type, but currently there is none there. So in the API, we don't actually use rec here at all. We just send directly back all the data stories. But let's say that we want to post a story, something that actually takes a parameter. So in new post info.js, we see that we make a call to post API. And we also pass in some type of parameter, which contains the value, which is the story that I want to post. So here, post API, and then here is the body. And here in API.js, I think this one is the one for story, we're actually using both rec and res. The request contains all the information that the client will be sending. So does this include this dictionary? This includes what is the content that I want to do. And then I will be able to use res to send everything back. So do people see kind of the two-way communication here? There's a client that is asking for information, and on the backend side, the backend is waiting for the client to ask us something with predefined endpoints and predefined functions.
Do we have any questions on how the stories get works? Thumbs up, thumbs down on how that works in the code.
Yeah.
Okay.
It may seem really confusing at first because there are two layers, kind of like agents going on here, but we are in one code file. So, and we're using very similar terminology, like both of them say post and both of them say yeah. And here we're trying to better distinguish what the two interactions actually look like. So are we on a better page now?
Why don't I show them what the post request that you just showed in the code is doing on the diagram. Can you pull up the new post input and API like side by side? API, yeah. Okay. All right. So let's say instead of just getting all the stories, we want to post a new story. I'm going to do that in 4H. So if we want to post a new story, the things that change here is just here, instead of a GET request, this becomes, where do I write this? A post request. And then instead of this body being empty, we want to send information about the story that we're posting to the backend. So here we would have like the creator, whatever, and then the content, or something like that. And so this will be sent in the request to the server. The server will receive the request, save it as, save that information in the data, and then it'll send back a response that says, oh, okay, you successfully created a story. And maybe that'll send back, like, the same story that the client gave it or something, etc., content, etc., okay. And then the client will receive the story and spit it off of it. Okay. Huh? Yes. Any questions on any of these things before we move on? Okay, cool. Also to segue into our feature thing, right now we have the data and the API all accessing the same, or like all running on the same process and same program. So our data is just a variable in the in our server code. But later today we're going to talk about databases, which is basically our server is just here, and then the database, the data is stored somewhere externally.
All right, so now we are going to go on to asynchronous JavaScript. So this will be between me and Jay, and we'll go into more depth about what these promises actually do and how to actually work with them. First, I'm going to go through some terminology.